When you clock out, can you point at anything on this planet and honestly say, that is better because I was here today? Most people can't. They answer with a job title, not a result. I'm a project coordinator. I'm in client success. Cool buzzwords. But if you vanish tomorrow, would anything in your town physically change? Meanwhile, there's a guy in steel-toed boots who can drive through his city and literally count the roofs he's put over people's heads. He went from 30 grand a year swinging a hammer to 7 figures in the bank before 40. And the disturbing part? Nothing about his brain or background was special. His name is Dan Morales. No famous TikTok, no best-selling book, no viral mentor montage. Just a high school C student who hated meetings and liked working outside. This is how a nobody roofer almost lost everything, then rebuilt his life and his bank account, one shingle at a time. Stick around, because buried in his story are 3 moves you can steal right now. How he stopped undercharging. How he hired without getting burned. And how he turned a broken body and a broken balance sheet into a business that pays him even when he's not on the ladder. Dan's first office was the front seat of a rusted F-150 that leaked more oil than a deep fryer. He was 19, freshly fired from a warehouse job for attitude issues, which is corporate code for asks too many questions. His uncle landed him a spot on a roofing crew. The first morning, he showed up in new sneakers. By lunch, they were ruined and so was his ego. He watched a 48-year-old foreman fly across a roof like a mountain goat, nail gun in one hand, cigarette in the other, yelling measurements from memory. Dan, on the other hand, needed Google just to convert feet into inches. But at the end of that first week, something weird happened. Driving home, he looked in the rearview mirror and saw an entire house he'd helped cover. It wasn't a spreadsheet. It wasn't a deliverable. It was a literal family shelter, and it did not exist that way 7 days ago. The work was brutal. Summers on black shingles felt like working on a grill. Winters froze his fingers to the nail gun. He ripped his jeans more often than he bought groceries. And yet, the man with the dirtiest clothes on site drove the cleanest truck. Dan's boss, Miguel, owned the company. Miguel wore the same hoodie every day but somehow managed to disappear by 3 p.m. while the crew kept working. On Fridays, Dan watched Miguel hand out envelopes of cash, joke with suppliers on speakerphone, and still leave the yard smiling. Must be nice, Dan muttered one payday. Miguel heard him. Kid, he said, the roof doesn't care who owns the business. The bank account does. That line stuck. After 3 years, layoffs hit. The company lost a major builder contract and half the crew was cut overnight. Dan survived, but only because he was cheap labor and willing to do every miserable job. Tearing off rotten plywood? Dan. Loading dump trailers in the rain? Dan. He finally asked Miguel, how do I not be the guy who gets laid off every time something goes wrong? Miguel shrugged. Own something. Truck, tools, or the whole business. But own something. So Dan did the most dangerous thing a 22-year-old with a little pride can do. He decided he could run a roofing company better than his boss. He had no savings, no credit line, and no clue. What he did have was one paid-off nail gun, a ladder with 2 sketchy rungs, and a cousin who could paint a logo on the side of a used pickup. So he went to a small local bank, pitched himself as Morales Roofing Solutions, and walked out with a $5,000 credit card and a mountain of optimism. Here's the first lesson Dan learned the hard way. You don't get rich doing the work, you get rich pricing the work. But he didn't know that yet. To win jobs, Dan became what every new contractor becomes when they're scared. The cheapest guy in town. He'd show up to quote a roof, listen to the homeowner complain about outrageous prices, then chop his number until they smiled. He wasn't bidding, he was begging. If a competitor said 8,000, Dan would say 6. If someone else said 6, he'd say, I can probably do it for $5,400. For a while, it worked. In his second year, the business did just over $1 million in revenue. Dan wore that number like a gold chain. $1 million. He thought he'd made it. Then tax season hit. His accountant slid the numbers across the desk and coughed out the truth. Dan, you paid yourself less than your lowest laborer. Expenses had eaten everything: materials on credit, fuel, dump fees, callbacks to fix leaks he'd rushed, interest on that brave little bank card he kept swiping like it was a magic wand. He was exhausted, sunburned, and broke. He didn't own his truck. He didn't own his tools. He didn't even own his evenings. He spent them doing invoices at his kitchen table. Value created? Hundreds of roofs. Money kept? Almost nothing. Maybe you're not sweating on a rooftop, but does this sound familiar? You work every week, yet your account balance looks allergic to staying positive. Lesson 1. Dan rebuilt his pricing from the ground up. Miguel finally sat him down over coffee and said, Stop guessing. Know your numbers. Every nail, every mile, every hour. They reverse engineered a real price sheet. Fixed cost for materials. Labor at a rate that let his crew live like adults, not zombies. Overhead for insurance, equipment, and the rainy days that always show up. And finally, profit that wasn't an accident. If you feel slightly uncomfortable saying the price out loud, Miguel told him, you're finally close to charging enough. Dan raised his quotes by 25% across the board and braced for the world to end. It didn't. He lost a few tire kickers and started attracting customers who cared about quality more than coupons. But just as the math started working, life punched harder. It was late fall. Dan had 3 big jobs running at once, all for a single general contractor who promised steady work for years. So Dan did what almost kills every young business. He trusted one big client with his entire future. The contractor stalled on payments. Just waiting on the bank. Next Friday, I swear. You already know where this is going. One Friday, his crew showed up and found a padlock on the contractor's office. Company gone. So was Dan's $85,000 receivable. He still owed his supplier. He still owed his crew. And that bank that happily gave him a tiny credit card? They were suddenly less friendly on the phone. Stress has a funny way of making ladders more dangerous. Rushing to inspect a leak on a job he'd undercharged, Dan misplaced his foot, slipped on wet shingles, and rode gravity straight off a 1-story roof into a pile of scrap. Broken wrist. Torn ligaments. Doctor's note: no climbing, no lifting for at least 12 weeks. That night, he stared at his cast, his bills, and his empty calendar. His entire business model was now illegal according to his own medical chart. No ladders, no money. Have you ever built your income on a skill your body can't do forever? What happens when the knees, the back, or the eyesight start protesting? Dan was 26 and facing the question most people avoid until it's too late. Was he building a business or just renting his body to his own company? For a moment, bankruptcy looked like the cleanest option. Walk away. Get a stable job. Maybe even one of those air-conditioned offices with free LaCroix and mandatory HR trainings. Then he drove past one of his early roofs. It was ugly. The lines weren't straight, the flashing looked rushed, and he remembered underbidding it to impress the builder. The only thing worse than quitting, he realized, would be knowing he'd wasted all that pain becoming average. If the old game was Dan on every roof, the new game had to be Dan builds a machine that puts roofs on without him. That's where lesson 2 was born. Systems are boring until they're the only thing keeping you from going broke. Stuck on the couch, he did something he'd avoided for years. He documented everything that lived inside his head. He turned his chaotic process into checklists. How to set ladders safely. How to photograph damage for insurance. How to load trucks so nothing falls off on the highway. How to talk to neighbors who come outside angry about noise. Were they perfect? No. But they were written. And written beats Ask Dan every single time. Next, hiring. Up to this point, hiring had meant grabbing whoever texted back first and hoping they didn't disappear on payday. Now, forced into a foreman role by his caste, he asked a different question. What if I only hire people I trust on my grandma's roof without me there? He fired 2 chronic no-shows. Painful, because they'd been with him since the beginning. Then he offered a raise and a small bonus per job to the quiet guy who always finished first and never complained. Within a month, that quiet guy was running Dan's best crew. Customers started asking for him by name. Lesson 3. You're not paying for hours, you're paying for outcomes. Reward the people who deliver them. Blue-collar wealth is built when your name earns money you don't touch. With better pricing, written systems, and a foreman who actually cared, Dan did something radical. He stopped taking any job that didn't include a deposit. No more "we'll pay you when the bank releases funds." No more fronting materials because someone forgot their checkbook. He set a simple rule. 50% before materials hit the driveway. 50% when the homeowner could stand at the curb and say, "We're happy." Did a few people walk away? Sure. But remember that 85 grand that vanished? He'd already paid twice that in stress. Within a year of that fall, Dan's revenue was actually lower. But his profit was higher. He did fewer jobs, with better margins, and slept more than 4 hours a night. 3 years later, the numbers looked like this. For crews running without Dan on site. An office manager handling phones, permits, and collections from a tiny rented storefront. A part-time marketing assistant filming every project for social proof. Dan still wore boots, but more often he was walking lots with adjusters or filming short videos explaining why cheap roofs leak. He went from being the cheapest option to being the guy people waited 2 months to get. Total revenue, just under $4 million. Net profit, 22%. That's $880,000 before taxes. The kid who was scared to charge $8,000 for a roof now regularly quoted 15 and didn't blink. Did every year look like an Instagram success graph? Of course not. Materials spiked, storms missed his market, a bad hire stole tools once. But when things went wrong now, the business bent, it didn't break. And that's the point most people never reach, because they're too busy convincing themselves they're lucky to have a job that doesn't actually build anything for them. Look, not everyone watching this wants to start a roofing company. You might be in HVAC, trucking, landscaping, or still trapped under fluorescent lights in a cubicle that smells faintly of burnt coffee and broken dreams. So what do you do with Dan's story? First, audit your work the way he audited his roofs. After every week, ask, what did I create that still exists when I'm sleeping? If the honest answer is nothing, that's not a reason to spiral. It's a signal. Second, start owning something, even if it's tiny. A pressure washer and a Saturday route. A used box truck and a couple of repeat delivery clients. A single maintenance contract you service before or after your shift. Don't wait for a perfect business plan. Dan's first plan was don't die and don't fall. He improved it under pressure. Third, treat your body like part of the business, not a disposable tool. If your income depends on your back, knees, or shoulders, you need a timeline to shift from I do the labor to I lead the people who do the labor. Write down the steps of your work. Train someone else while you can still demonstrate it. Charge enough that you can afford to step back a little each year. That's how you go from being the guy on the ladder to being the name on the trucks, to being the owner who can point at 40 neighborhoods and quietly think, My work is all over this town. Then one day, someone stuck in a meaningless job will drive past your projects, see your logo, and wonder how you pulled it off. If this story gave you a concrete picture of what's possible with dirty hands and clear math, hit like and subscribe to Work Boots to Wealth so YouTube keeps putting real-world playbooks in front of you instead of more empty motivational fluff. Because your time on the clock should buy you more than sore knees and a name badge. It should buy you freedom, assets, and a town full of proof you were here.